Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Printed here. In today's video, I'm going to introduce Flask to you by building this very simple guestbook app. So what this guestbook does is it has a list of comments that have been signed here. And let's say David, here is a guestbook comment. And we see that David's comment appears here. So it's a very simple app, but it actually has a lot of things that are common to any web app that you'll build. So by building this, you'll learn how to do things in general. So that's what I'll be covering in this video. If you want to get the code to this app, you can go to the link in the description below to get the code. And also, if you want to get this Flask cheat sheet, which I've created that has a bunch of different things that you would do in Flask, just go down to the link in the description below, or you can go to prettyprinted.com/Flask. So let's get into building the app. To get started, the first thing I need to do is install Flask and Flask SQL Alchemy. So those are the two libraries that I'll be using for this project. So pip inv install Flask SQL Alchemy as well. You can use pip alone if you have a virtual environment, but I'm using pip inv, so it kind of combines the packages with the virtual environment. But if you're familiar with virtual environments in Python, you can create your own and then install Flask and Flask SQL Alchemy. Basically, you're just running pip install instead of pip inv install. So, gonna wait for this to install everything. Okay, so now both packages are installed, and I'll just go ahead and start up the virtual environment. And then I'll back out of the directory of my project. So that's important because this project is going to have a dunder init file in it. So the folder will be treated as a package. So I'll reference the package as a whole from outside of the folder. So that's why I just went up one directory. And this is going to be the beginning of our project. So the very first thing I need to do is import Flask. So from Flask, import Flask. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to create a function that will create the application object. So the app object is just basically what gets called to initiate your web app. So this app object kind of holds everything that represents your web app, and then some web server or some app server somewhere will actually run this app object. So to create the function for this, you just name it create app. You can actually name it whatever you want, but create app is what most people use. And then the first thing you need to do is create this actual app object. So you instantiate it through Flask. So Flask, and then you pass in the name of the current module here. And this app is actually going to get everything that represents our web app. So after that, I'll simply return it. And what happens is when Flask, on the local machine, when Flask goes to run your app, it's going to be looking for this function, and it's going to call it, and it's expecting an app gets returned a response. So to do that, the way it's done in Flask now is you export an environment variable called Flask app, and then you assign it to be the name of the package. So in this particular case, it's Flask guestbook. So this is why I went back one directory, went up one directory, I should say, is because this dunder init makes my Flask guestbook folder a package. And I can just export Flask app equals to that folder name, Flask guestbook. And then when I go to run it, everything should work. So I'll know if it's working correctly when I do Flask run. And I get this URL here. So let's see what happens. If I go to the URL there, it says not found. That's actually good. The reason why it's not found is because I have no endpoint set up in my app yet, so I can't actually navigate anywhere. But by having the not found, we know the server is actually running. If I stop the server with Control-C and try going here again, instead of getting this 404 page, I'll get unable to connect, which means there's no server there at all. So at least we know the server is running when we do Flask run. And you see here there's a debug mode. Debug mode is off. It's helpful to turn debug mode on. So to do that, you export another environment variable called Flask debug, and you can set it to anything. That would just make it true. So Flask debug equals 1 is where I have it. And then Flask run again, and we'll see debug mode is on. What debug mode does is it allows us to not worry about stopping and starting the server manually. Instead, every time you save, the server will detect that and restart. So I just saved it and it restarted. So it detected a change here and it reloaded the server. So that's very convenient when you're actually writing code. So this is the beginning of our app. And as you can see right now, it doesn't do anything, but that's why we have the views. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this views. So views are going to represent the URL endpoints that people can go to. So for instance, when you go to just this without anything after the domain and the port, you have the index. If you have something like my view, then /my view will be a view or an endpoint or a route. They're basically the same thing. So what I want to do is I want to create an endpoint for the index. So to do that first, I need to import a couple of things. I need to import blueprints, and then I'll import render template, and I'll use that momentarily. So what a blueprint does is it kind of sections off your views into logical groupings. So for this app, because I'm not doing anything crazy, the grouping will just be one, and I'll call that main. But for example, if you had a really complicated app, you can have groupings like admin, login, main, forum, store. So all those are different groupings of potential endpoints of your app. So the admin group will have views or routes that are related to the admin section. The login will have views and routes related to logging in. So something like a login screen, logouts, maybe a profile, maybe a confirm email page, stuff like that. So like I said, I'm only going to have one grouping here, but you could potentially have more. So I'm going to create the first grouping and the only grouping in this particular one. And it's going to be a blueprint, like I said. So you give it a name, main, and then you pass in the name of the module as well. So it's similar to how we instantiated Flask here. And then what we can do with this main object here is add routes to it. So what you do is the @ sign, which is the decorator, main.route. And then here, this is where you specify the endpoint. So if you just do /, that represents the base URL. But anything you add after that, so if I do my view, then this will represent my view. So I'll just leave the / there. And then here you give it a name that's relevant to what you're doing. And inside of the function, this is where you do everything that you want to do for that particular page. In this case, all I want to do is return some text to the user. So I'll type in a return statement. And what happens with this return is anything that's returned is converted to HTML by default. So I can put HTML tags in here. I'll put a header tag. I'll save this, and the server should restart automatically. And let's see what happens. Well, nothing. So I added the index route, but still I have not found. Well, the reason why that's happening is because this blueprint hasn't been registered on my app. So like I said here, this app is going to hold everything associated with our web app, but I haven't associated the blueprints here with our app. You see, there's no connection between the code here and the code here. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import that blueprint and then register it on the app. So inside of this create app function, I'm going to do from views import main, and I'll call this, we can leave it as main. And then on the app object, I'm going to register blueprint, and I'm going to pass in that blueprint main there. So now we see the app object that I created has that blueprint on it, and it gets returned to the Flask server. So now everything should have restarted. I reload and we see hello here. So now that one route that I created is on my app and I can actually view it. If I go somewhere else, so something else, I get not found again. But quickly, if I go here, now that I've registered the blueprints, I can do something like this. So something else and something else, return something else. So this is just to demonstrate how anything I add here will now be available for me to go to. So something else, and we see something else here. And if I change it by a little bit, then we get not found again. So I'll remove this. But back to the dunder init file momentarily. Notice that we have the import here inside of the create app. The reason why this is done is because we want to avoid a circular import. So if we put this outside of the create app, in this particular case, it may not hurt, but with other things, you have, say, like the database being used or some other part of the app being used, and it depends on a different part of your app. So what you want to do is you want to put it in here after the app object has been created. So like I said, the app object holds everything about your app. So there's going to be more code that goes in between here. And that just allows us to use those things that are on our app in other parts of our app. And this will probably make more sense once I actually get to doing something like that. So now that I have this, I'll go back to my views file. And remember I said I'm going to use the render template function. The render template function, what it does is instead of you having to just type in HTML here, you can create a separate file that has HTML in it, and then you can reference that file using render template, and then it will just return all the HTML that's in that template. And the nice thing about the template is you can put some code in there to make it dynamic. So if you want to add some variables in the template, you can. If you want to add loops, you can, and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the first template. So I'll create a new folder, and by default, your templates directory needs to be named templates. And this is where Flask is going to look for your templates. And then I'll create a new file inside of the templates directory, and I'll call it index.html. And I already have some HTML written. So this is just a really basic page. All it does is display a page header and some comments. So what I'll do is I'll remove this hello, and I'll change it to render template and then index.html. So I'll save that. And then when I run this again, we see this changes. So I see guestbook here, and I see name here. So this is basically what's on the page. Now, the reason why it looks like this is because I don't have the styles loaded. So if I go here, we see there are 3 links, but there are no references to the actual static files. So to do that, I need to create a static file directory. So we'll call that static. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy the static files I need for the project into my static directory. So I'll open up the folder, I'll go to static, and I'll just paste it in there. So it's just a CSS directory, and it has 4 files: bootstrap.min, bootstrap theme, sign, and theme. So to reference those, what I'm going to use is the URL for function. And the URL for function allows me to get a file that has a URL somewhere. So what Flask does is automatically it will create a URL for each file in static and allows me to navigate to it. So now that I have this, let's take a look. So if I go here, it should be something like static, CSS, and then theme. Let's see, what was the name of it? Theme.css. So we see I have some CSS here. That's because Flask created a reference to this by taking everything that's in the static directory and making it public. This doesn't work the same for templates, so I can't just change this to templates. It's only for the static directory because most web apps are going to have static files. So I'm going to use URL for to reference that URL that Flask automatically creates for me. So URL for here. So the first one is bootstrap core CSS. So that's going to be bootstrap.min. So we do URL for static, so that references the static path, and then we pass in a file name. So this file name is just the relative location inside the static directory. So CSS/bootstrap, and let's see, what is it? bootstrap.min.css. And then we can close this out. And let's see. This apostrophe needs to be there, and it looks okay. So what's going on here is when you use the double curly brackets, it's basically allowing you to run a Jinja statement. So Jinja is the name of the template engine. It's what allows you to run code inside of your HTML template. And The statement or the function that I'm calling is URL4. Pass it in static, so that gets me the static path, and then the file name inside of static, so css/bootstrap.min.css. So if I save this and run it again, we see the style changes a bit. So there are a couple of other styles that I want, and the process is the same. So I'll just copy this, and I'll just rename the file. So the other one is bootstrap-theme. And then the final one for this style is theme.css. So now if I do this again, this is the final style that I want. So we see it looks a lot better. And we see we have the guestbook here, and then here are where all the comments are going to appear for our guestbook. So if you notice, there is a link to sign the guestbook, but when you click it, nothing happens. So what I want is I want this to take us to another route for actually signing the guestbook. So what I'm going to do is URL4, and this time instead of passing in static, all I need to pass in is the name of the function for the route that I'm going to reference. So if I just pass in sign, what it's going to do is it's going to look for a route called sign. So when I do this again, I get an error. It says could not build URL for endpoint sign. And the reason why is because I haven't created it yet. So let me go ahead and create it here. So main.routes and then /sign. And then I'll create the function sign. And then what I'm going to do is return a template. Well, let's start with just returning sign page so we can see if this works or not. So I run this again, and then it still fails. So what it's telling me is, do you mean main.sign instead? And that's actually what I do mean. When you use URL4, you need to make sure that if you're using a blueprint, you reference the name of the blueprint first. So in this case, main with a period and then the name of the function. So in the main blueprint, look for the sign function. So now if I run the app again, it works. And then if I click the link, it takes me to the sign page, which doesn't really exist yet. So what I'm going to do is create another template. So I'll go to my templates directory and I'll create a new file, and I'll call this sign.html. And I'll bring in the code for the sign page. And it's very similar. So I'm going to take the URL4 code and just update it with the correct CSS file. So the core CSS for Bootstrap is the same, but for the other one, it's going to be sign.css instead of theme. So sign.css. And now if I run this again, I need to actually return the template. So return sign.html. If I run this again, we see this is what the guestbook looks like. So now if you take a look at these two files, we see there's a little bit of overlap. They both have the beginnings of an HTML file, they have CSS files, and then they have a body here. What I want to do is I want to take everything that's common and put them in one file. So what I'm going to do is create a base template. So I'll create a new template. I'll call this base.html. And inside of the base.html, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this like a parent template. So this is going to have everything that all the other templates in my project will have. And then the parts that are unique to particular pages, I'll have placeholders for that. So I'll copy the index here. And what I'll do is I'll look for anything that should be specific to a particular page. So starting with this, we have the title. Instead of having guestbook here, since this is more generic, I'll put a placeholder. And the placeholders are called blocks. So to create a block, you use the curly bracket and then %, and then block, if I can spell that correctly. And then you give the block a name. So a good name for the title block is simply title. And then you just call the closing tags in block here. And then for the CSS, I'll do something similar. So notice that both files have the bootstrap.min.css. So bootstrap.min.css and bootstrap.min.css. So that's common to both, so I don't have to worry about it. But the other CSS is unique to each file. So what I'll do is I'll make a block for the extra CSS. So starting here, I'll create block and I'll call this CSS, and then I'll have an end block here. And then what I'll do is I'll remove the extra CSS because that's going to come from the particular files. And then going down here, each file has a different body. So I'll remove the stuff that's inside of the body and I'll put a placeholder. So we'll call this the body block in block. Okay. So now we have the placeholders, and then everything else is going to be the same for both files. So all this HTML stuff at the beginning is the same for each file. They both have the same beginning CSS file, and they both have like closing body tags and a closing HTML tag. So to convert these over to using that template, what I'm going to do is call the extends command, and I'll reference the name of the template that is the parent template. So extends base.html, that's what I named it here. And then I can just start using those same blocks. So remember, I have a block for title. So what you do is you just put the title in between. So guestbook. And anything that's in between these blocks will be injected into these blocks here. So there's a symmetry between the base template and the actual child templates. And then I'll do something similar for CSS. So block, CSS. And this one is going to be multiple lines, so I'll format it like this. And I'll take the extra CSS files, so these two, and I'll put them in here. And we can format this a little bit. And then finally, what I'll do is I'll take the body, so everything between the body tags, and I'll put it inside of the body block. Block, body. And then I can get rid of everything else because this is the generic code. And let's format this again. So now if we go back to the index, hopefully everything still works. And it does. And to kind of prove that this is working correctly, inside of here, inside of my index file, I'll change guestbook to guest tests. And if it changes, we know it works. So it changes, so everything is fine. I'll change it back to book. And then I'll do the same thing for sign.html. So I'll just bring in these because it's going to be similar. I'll put them at the top. So we have the extends.base.html. We have a title. The title for this one is sign the guestbook instead of just guestbook. The CSS for this is just this one file, sign CSS. So let's remove everything in here. And then finally, we have the body block. So block body, in block. And then I'll take everything inside of the body tag, put it in here, and then delete everything else. Let's take a look at the sign page now. It looks the same. Let's change one little thing about it to make sure it's working. Change that to test. And it looks like everything is okay. So now that I have that working, the next thing that I want to do is I want to work on actually getting this thing to work. So I want people to be able to submit comments. And then when you go to the home page of the guestbook, you see all the comments are there. So right now, this is just a placeholder. What I want is the actual data from the database. So to begin, first thing I need to do is allow the user to submit this form. So I want them to pass in their name and some comment. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another route, and I'll call this sign again. But instead of this being just sign, this is going to be for the post method. So by default, these routes only work with GET requests. So basically, like you type something into the address bar and you go to that URL. But post allows us to submit the form to our app to be processed. So I'm going to have the same endpoint name, but a different method. So the code here is only going to get run when the user submits something, and the code here is going to be run when they actually navigate to the /sign URL. So I'll call this sign post. I can't name it the same as this because there would be a conflict. So the name of the function needs to be different. And then inside of here, I'm going to get the data from the form. So let's take a look at the data, or the form layout, how it sends the data. We have the name here is name, and we have a comment. So the name and comment gets sent along when the guest book gets signed. So to have access to that data, you have to import the request object, and then we can see what the user sends us. So to get this data, we're going to reference it using requests.form. So this is going to be form data. There are other things you can do like request.json, request.args, but this is going to be request.form because it's coming from the form. And then we're going to get the name of the data in the form. So in this particular case, it's name, and the other one is comment. And I'll assign these to variables. And just as a test, I'll return a string that displays this. So name is going to be name, and then comment. So let's see if this works. So name Anthony, test, comment. So we have Anthony and test comment, so we know that the data is getting processed correctly. And inside of the sign template, there's no action. I have the same endpoint for a sign, so the form will by default submit to the same endpoint. If this were different, like sign submit or something like that, then it wouldn't work. And to overcome that, if you decide to change the name of the endpoint, you can have the URL for here. So URL for, and then sign post. And there should be main in the beginning of it. And what this will do is, even if I change the name here, it's going to figure out where I need to submit the form. But I'll keep it as sign just to keep things straightforward, to kind of represent that this form is for this processing. So now that I have the data, I want to save it to the database, but I need a database first. So to create a database, the first thing I need to do is import the library called Flask SQL Alchemy. So from Flask SQL Alchemy, import SQL Alchemy. So capital SQL, capital A, and then alchemy, or alchemy, and then instantiate the database object. So this is going to go outside of create app because I'm going to reference this in other files, but I don't have to pass anything to SQL Alchemy here. And then inside of my create app, I need to create some configuration for my database. So I need to tell SQL Alchemy where my database is. So if you have like a Postgres database on some server, you can reference it here, or my SQL database. In our case, for this app, I'm going to use a SQLite database, which is just a file that is going to be in the project directory. So to add any configuration to your project, use the app.config, and you pass in the name of the configuration value. So for SQL Alchemy, that's going to be SQL Alchemy database URI. And then you pass in the actual URI for the database. So if you're using like a Postgres database, it would be something like Postgres, and then some URL, maybe a port, a username, a password, and so on. But since we're using SQLite, it's very simple. It's just SQLite, 3 slashes, and then this is going to represent a file that is in our project directory. So I'll just call this db.sqlite3. You can name your database whatever you want, but I'm calling this db.sqlite3. And then what I want to do is I want to actually create a table for my database. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'll name it models, and I'll create a SQL Alchemy model. So I'm going to import that DB object here because that's really important. So that's why I put it outside of create app. I'm importing it from the dunder init from our package. And then I'm going to create a class, and this class is going to represent a table in our database. So by using a class, what we're doing is we're creating a connection between the class and the database, and SQL Alchemy takes care of that connection for us. So when we want to do something to the database, what we're actually doing is we're manipulating the class and the objects of that class. So I'll create a class and I'll call it comment.dbModel. And inside of the class, the attributes of the class represent the rows in the table. So every table needs an ID column. So if you call db.column, that will create a new column for you. I want this to be an integer column because it's just an ID. And I'll set primary key to true. And then I'll create two other columns. So this represents the actual data that I'm interested in. So we'll have a name column and a comment text column. So the name column is going to be a string instead of an integer because it holds a name. And I'll make this 30 characters long, so no one can have a name over 30 characters, but that shouldn't be a big deal. And then I'll create a comment text column, and this is going to be a little bit longer. Let's say they can leave a comment up to 1,000 characters. So now that I have this is the beginning of the table in my database. My database doesn't actually exist yet, but I'm going to create it now. So what I need to do, after having created this URI, I need to actually associate the database with my Flask app. So to do that, I call db.init app, and I pass an app. So we see the configuration is on the app object here, and I'm now taking the app object and associating it with the DB object. So now that there's a connection there, I can actually use a database. So I'll go ahead and stop the app. So we'll start up Python, and I want to import a couple of things. So first I'll import from my project, so the stuff in the dunder init file. So import db and create app. So I'll use create app along with db in a moment. And I also need to import my model. So from Flask guestbook.models, import comment. And the reason why I import the model, even though I won't be using it directly here, is because there's really no connection at the moment between this file and this. So by importing the model, it kind of updates the DB object here. So what I'll do is db.createAll, and I'm going to run app, or I'm going to pass in the app by running create app here inside of this create all function. So if I run that, we see a new file gets created over here. And let's see if I can open it in here. My VS Code database browser doesn't always work. So let's try the SQLite tool directly. So Flask guestbook /db.sqlite3. Look at the tables, and we see here I have a comment table. So I know that's working correctly. So I can start up my app again, and I can go back to the view and save to my database now that I have it up and running. So to actually use the database in my code, I'm going to import the DB object here. So from my project, import DB, and I'll also import the model. So from .models, import comment. And now I can use the comment model, and anything I do to the comment class, it's going to be reflected in the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new comment. So we'll call this new comment, and it's going to be an object from my class comment. So I instantiate the class, and the values that I start with are simply the data that I want to go into those columns. So I have two columns, name and comment text here. So the name is going to be the name that the user passes in, and the comment text is going to be the comment that the user passes in here. So after I've created this new comment, I'll add it to the session. So db.session.add, what this does is it tells SQL Alchemy you want to actually create a new row with this object data here from new comment. So new comment. And then I want to commit. So basically commit is saving. So db session commit. And now I don't need to return the name and the comment here, but instead what I want to do is I want to redirect the user back to the main page. So I need to import a couple of things called redirect in URL4. URL4 should be familiar because we have it in the templates. It's used in a very similar way, but redirect is going to redirect the user somewhere. So I call the redirect function here. And then inside of the redirect, I'll call URL4, and then I'll reference the name of the route that I want to redirect to. So in this particular case, main.index. So let's go ahead and try. I'll try signing the guest book, Anthony, and this is the first comment. Sign, and it redirects me to the home page. As we can see, nothing changed. I don't actually see my name in my comment, and that's because I can't view that until I actually say I want to look at it in the index function here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to query the database. So I'm going to use the comment class again, and by calling query.all, this is going to return all the comments in the comment class to me. And I'll assign this to a variable called comments. And then what I'll do is I'll pass this variable to the template. So I'll give it the same name as the parameter, and I'll pass in the comments. And what this does is then inside of the template, I can reference comments using the brackets just like this. So what I'm going to do is I'll create a loop. So it's going to be a for loop. So for comments in comments. So comments is what I pass in from here. So for each comment in there, so it's going to loop over. It's going to execute the code in between the tags. So I'll put in for here. And then I can reference particular things on the comment. So if I want to reference the name, I'll just do comment.name. If I want to get the ID, I can do ID, but I won't be using that, just name and the comment text. So instead of this is a comment as a placeholder, I'll have comments.comment text. So this is just getting the data from that particular column with the row here of comment. So now let's try running it. And we see Anthony here, and this is the first comment. So now everything should be working. So if I go here and I say Becca, here is another comment, sign it, then Becca's name appears. And if I do Charlie, another comment by Charlie, we see that Charlie is there. So now my guest book is working, and anyone who wants to come to my guest book and sign can now sign. So as you can see, creating a guest book isn't too difficult in Flask. I hope I was able to explain the basic features of Flask. Obviously, there's a lot more that you could do in Flask that I didn't cover, but by watching the other videos on this channel, you will learn how to do additional things in Flask to make your app more powerful. So that's it for this video. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. And if you have a comment about anything, just leave a comment down below. And don't forget, you can go to my website to get the code for this if you want, or the Flash cheat sheet, or both. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.